Good morning. Welcome to our Wild Things 2021 session on growing through change, sourcing climate resilient seed. Last time we spoke about this particular topic was in our September 2020 workshop. Today we're going to recap just a little bit about what that workshop showed by sharing some pre-workshop survey results. And we're also going to re-present one of the presentations to provide an overview of the topic, climate change and sourcing plant materials for climate resilience. Then we're going to provide an update of the working group that has continued to meet frequently since our September workshop, introducing some of the work that we've done using species distribution models and their application to sourcing single species. We've also recorded a panel discussion overviewing some of the opportunities and pitfalls of using species distribution models. And then finally, we'll have a question and answer session. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat feature. We will take the opportunity to answer all of those questions at that one time. If there's time after that, we might do a breakout session just to get your feedback on how you are sourcing for climate resilience and what your success has been like. So our 2020 workshop in September had 124 participants. They were seed producers, folks from nonprofit organizations, municipal agencies, researchers, volunteer stewards, and over 50% of those consider themselves to be both producers and users of seed. Producing seed could be as simple as hand collecting from a local source site, or it could be a commercial vendor who's producing hundreds of pounds of seeds for sale. The vast majority of our participants work either in remnant natural areas or in restoring agricultural landscapes. Most participants do source from multiple populations for any given projects, although they don't necessarily have a formal bid process for competitive bidding. The average size of the restorations are pretty small, but that's because most of our participants are working on a very small scale. Most of them had an acre that they might be restoring, and a few participants were restoring as much as 150 acres at a time. Most organizations do have some kind of formal policy or guideline in place, but only about a third of them actually consider climate resilience as part of those formal guidelines. And most people do source from more than one producer. So we hope that you will consider joining our climate resilient seed sourcing working group. We do meet regularly, and we represent a broad array of agencies and institutions, and we're always looking for additional perspectives to inform this topic. So we'll provide contact information at the end of the session and hope that you'll consider joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this exciting webinar conference that's called Growing Through Change, Sourcing Climate Resilient Seed for Ecological Restoration. My name is Julie Ederson, and I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and also the director of the Institute on the Environment in Duluth. I am here today to tell you a little bit about the work that I've done over the years to study the impact of climate change on native species. And I'm just going to start out with this really cool model that was developed for Glacial National Park. And so you can see it's stepping over time. And in the first years, there is a description based on color of what used to be on the ground: rock, glaciers, grasslands, coniferous, deciduous, etc. Different kinds of vegetation based on old photographs and notes, and then eventually on satellite imagery, and then pushing into the future based on climate modeling. And so you can see really obviously with this little map what's happening by 2040 or 2030. We've completely lost the glaciers at Glacial National Park. I think here it's going to flip back to see what it was like in previous decades. And what you notice is that as it's warmed over time, the kind of vegetation that occurs in the park has gradually moved up elevation. And so species like this lupin or species like this pica are moving up and hopefully still having some place to persist on the mountaintops, whereas other species like this bear grass or an elk are displacing them across space. But there are similar patterns across the United States. So if you look at this USDA plant hardiness zone map, here is one from 1990, and it shows me up here in the frigid land of Duluth, Minnesota in zone 3, where you cannot get a tomato to ripen by the end of the summer. But over the course of time, things have really changed in Duluth. Now we're fully in zone 4, and I can grow tomatoes, but also we're seeing gradual changes in the vegetation that's around us. And basically, we are having climate that's moving up latitude, and we're having changes in the vegetation that are also moving up latitude. But this really only happens if you have a continuous landscape, like in a preserved national park. But we all know that that is not the case across a lot of the land. And here's just an example from Stearns County, Minnesota, a depiction of pre-settlement vegetation based on bearing tree data. And you can see that all these yellow and golden yellowy patches are prairie. And now I'm going to switch to a contemporary map to show you how much of that is left. And in the new map, anything that's white is vegetation that has been completely degraded or destroyed by human behavior. So are you ready? Here we go. Boom! If you really squint, you can find these little patches of prairie, but basically it is embedded in an agricultural landscape. And so the potential for populations to be able to hop, skip through dispersal across this landscape and move into a habitat that might be more appropriate could be obstructed because of habitat degradation. So given this scenario, I actually have spent most of my career trying to figure out if plants can't move, do they have the genetic diversity to evolve or adapt rapidly enough to keep pace with climate change? And here are 3 species that I've worked on, and just really simply, I'll tell you that the answer for Camiocrista fasciculata is definitely no. They cannot evolve fast enough. The answer for Campanulostrum americanum is that some traits can evolve fast enough, like flowering time, but it causes maladaptation in many other ways that affect survival and fitness. I've also worked in this goldenrod species, which is a little odd because it has both diploid, 2 sets of chromosomes, and hexaploid, 6 sets of chromosome populations that are segregated across space. Hexaploids cannot evolve fast enough. Diploids can. But the bulk of evidence suggests that plants cannot evolve. They cannot adapt fast enough to keep pace with climate change. So what do we do? Well, in the latter part of my career recently, I've been thinking more about what we put in our restoration sites. You know, we're doing all this restoration, and we're just going to have to do more and more of it into the future. So what material should we use? Should we use local, or should we be thinking about using plant material that might be pre-adapted to the climates of the future, or at least catch up with how much climate change has already happened? So this is where I live, on the shore of Lake Superior, and this is what the vegetation looks like. It is a dying birch forest with very little new tree species coming up in the understory. And so this is the platform upon which I have been doing collaborations with the Nature Conservancy, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, to test what it is that we should be planting here. And so here's just some of the planning partners and some of the implementation partners from the Nature Conservancy, and also my own graduate students. So we started this project maybe 7 years ago now, and we used existing data to help inform our plan, like what should we plant. Minnesota is a hot spot for climate change. Already there's been 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius change in our area. And so this corresponds to about a 240 kilometer shift in the climate that was in southern Minnesota, moving up into our region along the edge of Lake Superior. And if you look at the vegetation of the state, what you notice is that 240 kilometers south, it's more mixed deciduous as opposed to boreal species in the more northern climate. So this suggests that maybe we need to be using more southern species in addition to seed sources if we're thinking about planting for the future. We also use climate models to inform our plan. So here's a model by one of my colleagues that shows boreal species are really predicted to decline and temperate species are predicted to increase. And so we focused on white pine, bur oak, and red oak because red maple's already getting into these areas, and basswood seeds just simply weren't available. And we use state policy to inform our planning. So right now, these are the seed zones, seed planting zones of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And their rules are that if you want to plant in seed zone 104, then you need to obtain your plant material from seed zone 104 and plant it back into the same area. So the idea that local is best. But what we wanted to test was maybe it's better to go a little bit further south and plant into northern environments. And so this is the experiment that we did. We planted 110,000 trees into 2,000 logged acres in like 2012, and some subset were in a formal design so we could go back and identify them and measure them really careful, which we've been doing up until and continuing right now. And our major hypothesis was that plants from a more southern zone, ecotype if you like, 105, would grow better when planted in a northern environment because the climate change has already happened. And so this was a cool project because we achieved the applied goals, which were to do a big restoration project. And we also achieved academic goals by collecting data, analyzing it, and you can read more details about it in this paper, but I'll tell you a little bit of the results. Some of our trees were planted containerized, some of them were planted bare root. This is what the sites look like. we tagged the 5,000 that we tracked carefully, and they were protected from deer browse. And then some were in a formal design so that we could go back and actually locate each specific tree. And then we tracked their survival, their traits, in the environment that they lived in. We looked at how fast they grew, both in terms of height and stem diameter, how thick their leaves are. I mean, think of a succulent, right, with a big thick leaf. That promotes water conservation. And we also monitored the timing of events or phenology. So like in the spring, we went out there and look at when the buds burst for the pine and also for the oaks. And then for the oaks, we also looked at fall phenology, like when did the leaves start changing? When did they fall off? And so for environmental attributes, we looked at what other plants were on the ground, what the soil was like, and also how much light individual trees were getting. So after 4 years, do seedlings planted one zone further to the north do better? So I'm just going to show you oak data today. And the first thing we're going to look at is survival. So first, let me say that there is high survival throughout this experiment. These trees that are right on the edge of their northern distribution did very well. As you can see, survival rates are all over 90%. And for both species, the more southern population, 105, did better than its northern counterpart in terms of survival. However, that was only statistically significant for red oak. That's what that little star means. And just kind of same trend for bur oak, but not scientifically acceptable to say they're different. So how about the timing of events? Well, here is bud burst date on the top, and you can see the more northern, the more southern population in the dots here. Both species burst their leaves out later. And they also dropped their leaves later. And in combination, if you look at the timing between the day the first leaf burst and the timing that the leaves dropped, we can look at how many days of active photosynthesis was happening. And you can see that the southern population of both of these species retain their leaves for longer, which perhaps means that they're able to have greater transpiration and carbon gain, photosynthesis, over the growing season. How about for leaf thickness? Well, here you can see for both southern populations of both species, the southern population had thicker leaves, and that is usually associated with greater water use efficiency. And I just want to show you a fun picture from a drone that was taken this summer of one of my graduate students who is actually measuring the rate of water loss on these trees by putting this giant chamber over them and actually looking at how much CO2 and water vapor is coming and going out of these plants. Growth rate is a little bit weird. The northern bur oak grew faster above ground, and the southern red oak grew faster above ground, but it still could be adaptive in the way bur oak grows, because this species generally tends to allocate more energy to below ground biomass acquisition, especially in the juvenile years. Here's just a comparison of root to shoot ratio. And so you can see that generally bur oak grows by investing a lot in roots at the beginning, as opposed to red oak, which invests more in above ground biomass. So that below ground, if there is below ground allocation in that way, slower growth of the southern population might actually be advantageous. So do these trait differences even really matter? And we can ask that question by looking at whether or not a trait like leaf thickness impacts survival. In other words, is there a correlation between whether or not a plant survived and whether or not it had thick leaves or early bud burst? And so that's what this table is showing. And so anything that has stars means that it's significant. And so what this is showing, the negative sign means that for bur oak north and south and red oak north, it was really important to burst buds earlier. That's why that sign is negative. Whereas red oak 105 seemed to be doing it just about at the right time. And if you look at leaf senescence, you can see that it didn't make any difference when leaves fell for bur oak, but for red oak, the ones from 105 that dropped later had a big advantage. For all of the populations, having thicker leaves was better, and this resulted, and also trees that had higher growth rates ultimately ended up surviving better. So should we be doing climate-informed restoration now? Well, this study showed that at least with these 3 tree species, that each has a distribution near the northern edge of the species range, it might be a good idea. They had high survival, and it also looks like southern trees do better in northern environments, and that selection is favoring plants that are able to keep their leaves out during the longer growing season that we have now, that they have thicker leaves that might help them conserve water in late summer drought, which is becoming more common. And this experiment will continue to provide more evidence of this into the future. But the question that I would like you to leave you with is whether or not we have enough information to do this on a broader scale. And I would say that we should continue to do academic and applied collaboration on many different species and achieve both the applied and the academic goals, while also improving our understanding of how well this approach might actually work. And I would like to thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you for joining us for this session of Wild Things 2021. I'm going to talk to you today about using models to create some seed transfer guidelines for climate resilient restoration. I've been working on this with the Climate Resilient Seed Sourcing Working Group, and the members who are the primary members are my co-authors for this presentation. Since our 2020 workshop in September, we have really been trying to establish how to approach writing guidelines or coming up with guidelines for regional seed sourcing throughout the Midwest. And as a first step, we undertook a review of the existing literature. We used a variety of search terms, seed sourcing, seed provenance, restoration, and climate change. And we found that most of the literature is really focused on economically important tree species that are generally found in either Europe or North America. And so given the lack of representation for herbaceous species, we felt like we needed to take what literature was available and try and undertake a synthesis. And one paper in particular does provide a roadmap for an approach. And this paper by Romalo, Byrne, and Yates advocates using a mixed approach to seed sourcing based upon the projected rain changes in species ranges under climate change. And they really advocate using some web-based, very user-friendly GIS resources to model the direction and distance of rain changes for individual species. So doing species distribution models or niche model is pretty simple in concept. It's the idea that wherever you find a species currently, that provides evidence for its niche, the soil that it likes, the elevation that it likes, the precipitation patterns where it does well, that kind of thing. And if you put that into a geographic information system, you can layer these environmental elements and then search for the correlations, the spatial correlations among them, and then map the probabilities of the expected or the projected niche that the species should occupy based upon the places where we know they occupy. So it's a pretty simple approach. It seems pretty straightforward. As with all modeling efforts, the devil is in the details. And most of these efforts take advantage of publicly available data on species location, which can be good or may not be good at all. And then the other thing is that you don't want to use every single layer that's out there to try and determine what their habitat is. You want to do some statistics to try and figure out what are the most relevant pieces of their niche that really drive the occupation of that species, across its range. So this is a probability map of a distribution of Lespedeza leptostachya in 2000 that is based upon its current location, where we know that it occurs. This particular species has a very small distribution. This is really it. It's just found in gravel hill, prairies, and knobs in this 4-state region. And what we can see from this is that the hot spots, literally where it's warmer, brighter, redder, is really concentrated where there's a bigger concentration of the location data. And so we can use this type of model to determine the niche of where a species is, and then project it outwards, and then maybe do a field check, a ground truthing, and see if the species are unknown in locations that have a similar niche signature. And I've done this and have with researchers, and there's also been a whole lot of studies that have done this using this approach. And there's a really good agreement between the current niche model and these new, previously unknown locations for species. So it does look like this is a really good way of at least determining the fundamental niche that a species will occupy. Now, projecting forward to 2020, this model was actually created about 10 years ago. We estimated from the climate layers that the species bioclimatic envelope, the climate that it particularly does well in, would begin to move out of Illinois and further north and west. And one of the things that's really notable about this particular model is that it predicted that in the Illinois populations, springs would become wetter and colder, by about 2020, and other models predicted that it might really affect the germination rate of this particular species at those sites. And so the populations might decline as a result of this mismatch. And one of the interesting things is that spring temperatures around the time of germination really did have that signature. They're colder, they're wetter. And so this provides some evidence that even the climate modeling itself is well supported, at least in the near term. If we forward to 2050, 30 years into the future, we can see that the climate envelope, or the probability of where the best climate is going to be for this species, has really fundamentally shifted northwest by quite a bit. And in fact, what we see here in Illinois, there's no probability signature. So we would call this a range contraction here and a range expansion here. So it's not an entire range shift. It's not completely out of the climatic envelope, isn't completely out of the historic range, but it's trending there. And if we jump forward into 2080, it's a pretty big range shift altogether. And so if you look at the dot right there in the center, that is the centroid of the historic population, or the historic range of this species. And then the arrow indicates the direction and distance that the centroid for its distribution in 2080 is expected to be. So that's quite a big shift for that species. And if we were going to try and source seed for this potential range shift, we might start thinking about collecting seed in Iowa and Illinois, and then later on in southern Minnesota, so we could sort of assist its migration in response to climate change. Now, this is a composite map of 91 rare taxa that were studied in the western United States and 17 species that were studied in the eastern portion of the United States. The western portion of the United States, the topography is quite complex, and you have really small species ranges that may be on the side of a mountain, and these could be expected to move up elevation a few thousand feet. So the distance might not be very much, but the change in elevation could be pretty extreme from 2020 to 2080. And if you take all of those little arrows and put their centroids all in one place, you can see that in the western species, there's no overall pattern, and it's just a result of the microclimates that form as a result of the complex topography. In the eastern United States, on the other hand, we don't have quite the same complexity, and species ranges kind of move pretty broad distances, and it does seem that they have a general pattern. It's not perfect, but by and large, the species are expected to move sort of from into the northeastern direction. And so, if you look at this arrow right here, or even this arrow here, there's some suggestion that by 2080, maybe seeds that are collected here from particular species might be expected or might be a good fit climatologically for this region of Illinois. But as we can see here, this is all very species specific. I also want to say that this particular modeling effort was very time consuming to do for this many species because of the rigor that was attended to in terms of data cleaning and in terms of looking for correlations among all of those different geographic layers, etc. And that may not be necessarily approachable for someone who doesn't have really good GIS background or even access to a desktop GIS system. So there might be an online solution, but let's talk a little bit about ranges and how we might go about modeling the range of a species like big bluestem, which if you look at the map here, you can see it pretty much has this solid distribution across almost all of North America. And instead of using the really intensive desktop system, I used this pretty accessible online mapping app to undertake just this broad scale exploration of asking the question, what if? What if we look across the species range? Where is it going to move? And so if you just take the data that they have, that they've cleaned for us for this species, they're aggregating data from the places that collect data from herbarium museums across the world and make it publicly available. So they've taken that data, they've cleaned it up a little bit for us, and then they're applying a current climate model for us that we've asked it to do for this species. And so we can see we have the same sort of signature, the bright red where there's a congregation of location data for this species. If we look at the 2050 model and the expected range, there's not a whole lot of change. There's a little bit of a range expansion into the northeast, similar pattern to what we've seen before, but not, and a little bit of range contraction, but not a really big range shift. So we might take from that then that, maybe it's not a big undertaking to try and source this particular species because its range isn't going to change very much, and maybe just our standard local provenance, local collection is appropriate. But if we are thinking about sort of that northeastern movement and pattern that we've seen, and make a conjecture that maybe Missouri is where we should be sourcing our seed from, we might get a different pattern. Especially because, its range is not monolithic. There are just disjunct areas, particularly in the southern portion of the species range. And so the situation might be a little bit more complex than the full species range model might lead us to think. So if we just look at, kind of take a random subsample focused primarily in Missouri as a place to collect seed or to source seed from and do the future model, we see the same pattern. It lights up where we have the congregation of location data for this species. And if we project further into the future to 2050, we see that there's a big shift to the northeast, and it is to the northeast to, sort of the Chicago region, the Chicagoland region, the Chicago wilderness area. But you'll also notice that it's not completely out. So there's not a complete range shift, even for the smaller distribution that we're modeling here. So just kind of look at it together. We do see this pretty big range change, a kind of shift from Missouri to northern Illinois, but this portion hasn't completely contracted. And so using that all together, we see that there's a range expansion, not an outright full-on shift. We know that where we might be interested in undertaking a restoration project is found within the current and the projected range. It's a widespread species, it's wind pollinated, and local seed might be fine, but we might think that we could mix seed from Missouri or, sort of the southwestern portion of Illinois. This is considered to be composite provenance, where you're mixing sources to increase the genetic diversity, as well as facilitated adaptation to the potential climate shift that the species might experience. Let's look at a different species, one that is commonly used in restoration, and that is insect pollinated and with a little bit distribution. Here I'm just focusing on some of those random locations, focusing primarily in Missouri again. Here's the current climate probability distribution for this species. Here's the one for 2050. And you can see that when we're thinking about sourcing from Missouri, there is still that same range shift to the northeast, but there's a range contraction for those populations that are centered in Missouri. So this is a really different pattern than the species we looked at before. And so we might consider how that would affect our scenario for sourcing seed. Illinois right now there's not a great probability, it's not really lit up in this area right here. So it's not a great match right now, but it looks like it would be a great match for seed that's collected here now in about 2050. So here, again, the restoration location is within both the current and the projected range, but the climate fit seems better in the future with the Missouri provenance. And so here our strategy might be a little bit different. We might still do composite provenancing where we're mixing sources to increase the adaptive potential, especially, for including that southern provenance. But we might use a bigger ratio of seed from that southern provenance than we would for the grass species that we looked at previously. So one big question that I'm sure you have is, would we actually use this approach to source seed for a restoration project? And the answer is yes, but it's a provisional yes. We are using this approach in a demonstration project at Grant Woods Forest Preserve to see if it actually works. We're doing a side-by-side comparison where we're using our standard sourcing methods for a portion of our restoration site, and then we're using this climate provenance sourcing for the rest of it. Same species mix, same ratios of species, just sourced a little bit differently. And we will follow things like germination and establishment in the early days, and then over time also monitor things like differences, if there are any, in phenology. Do they flower at the same time? Or is the southern seed, do the plants that result from the southern seed flower too late and so don't have good seed fill because there's just a mismatch with our local environment. And so we will we'll monitor that, and we will continue to provide results from that over the coming years. So stay tuned, because I think that this is the only large-scale project that I know of that is using this approach, but if you have your own experiences where you found success or had failure using an approach like this, we would definitely love to hear about it directly from you. So thanks for tuning in today, and really want to thank all of our sponsoring organizations, as well as the Wildlife Conservation Society Climate Adaptation Fund, which has provided funding for the restoration project that I mentioned. I hope you've dropped some questions into the chat. We're going to have a little panel discussion now, and then we will have a Q&A for the whole session, and are looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
We're talking about a climate-oriented approach to support decision-making for seed provenance in ecological restoration. And the authors are Christina Romulo, Margaret Byrne, and Colin Yates. And this is printed in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution in 2017. Most of the work is focusing in Australia, but they really do a fabulous job of trying to help you frame climate-adjusted provenancing globally, regardless of where you are. Within that paper, there are a couple of different online resources that they provide, and they really are Australia-based. But there's one called Life Mapper that is pretty cool, and you can use it just about anywhere. Using the climate change scenarios that are available from the climate scientists as layers in a species distribution model is really the way to get a pretty clear picture of how the climate is going to change. And one of the things I think that we have to remember is that it's the climate that's migrating, and the species kind of come behind, if they can. And so I think that climate-adjusted provenancing is really all about trying to move the species kind of in a similar trajectory as the climate. The only issue from my perspective is that trying to undertake the modeling portion is really not for the faint of heart. And I say that because I've done a lot of it. And it is much easier for rare species that have these nice, tight distributions than it is for widespread species. And because they can be very difficult to interpret. And it is the widespread species that I'm primarily trying to figure out how climate is going to change their migration, et cetera. And so how do we use those patterns to source seeds for restoration?
Pati, what is it about the widely distributed species in particular? Why is that what you're most interested in or focusing on?
I'm interested in those widespread species because they're the ones that are kind of the workhorses for restoration. But they're also the ones that by and large have what we might call a really broad niche. So that means that we can use them in many places. Trying to figure out how climate might affect these species across their whole life history is really an important piece.
Yeah, establishment, of course, needs to happen, and then persistence is I think the ultimate goal for these species, and the filters will act differently on those different histories. There's so much uncertainty about climate change. I mean, change can mean changes in the average temperature, in the extremes of highs and lows of when those temperatures occur, and the same for precipitation events. So yeah, it's hard to have a very clear idea of the shifts that will be happening and how plants and animals will need to adapt. So I think what I like about this paper is it recognizes that uncertainty and still presents a lot of the theory and the background behind sourcing seed for climate resilience. And then as it walks the reader through this case study and the use of these openly available modeling tools, I think it does, like you said, Patty, it's not for the faint of heart, but it is accessible and something that any restoration practitioner or manager could attempt to work through for the species that they're most concerned or that they've prioritized.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Steph. And I think that this really provides a toolkit for restoration practitioners to use and to answer some of the questions that people working on the ground often have about where to source seed, because I think climate change is really at the forefront of a lot of people's considerations right now, but often it's difficult to know what tools to use. And so I think this paper really provides a very accessible way to start creating some of these models, although as Patti mentioned, it can be a little bit of a learning curve. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more too from you, Patti, about how some of the software compares to what you're used to using for building these models.
So typically I would do what this paper suggests, which is to use some kind of GIS or geographic information system software. And there's two that are kind of broadly available. One is kind of the gold standard in the industry. It's put out by ESRI or ESRI, and it's ArcGIS or ArcGIS Pro, which is what people are currently starting to move towards. But it's quite expensive. That typically has a bit more of a higher entry point, if you will, needing somebody who has worked with the software and been through some training.
The other platform is QGIS. It's freely available, and I have found it to be much more accessible and more intuitive to use than the Esri products.
And then there's this standalone product called MaxEnt, or short for maximum entropy, and that's the piece of software that does the modeling itself. And it uses an algorithm called maximum entropy to kind of look at and compare all of these environmental correlations with the location data for the individual species, and then distribute a probability map across that same spatial extent that you're looking at. MaxEnt seems to have really high accuracy in using those environmental attributes to predict where species are currently. If you have the ability to predict where the species are with high accuracy now, you can then use that same modeling approach and have less uncertainty when you're trying to project into the climate future.
I'm wondering, since it's the climate and you've done this modeling, if the paper discusses to pick the site of the project and do modeling based on that, if your project sites differ by 100 or 200 miles, does the range change? Because if it doesn't make much of a change, it might be a good idea for large areas like Chicago Wilderness that has a lot of restoration happening to maybe join forces and do modeling for some of these species that are hard to get. And then we can put that information out there, and all of the land managers in the Chicago Wilderness area, for example, could have access to that. And that would be a very useful tool. I would love to see it, but I wouldn't love to do the modeling myself.
This paper also suggests this great online tool called Life Mapper. I think that it's really accessible. Again, you have to be really cautious about your geographic extent, and it's the location data of the species that you're interested in, I think that you need to work really well with. What LifeMapper does, which I think is completely brilliant, you can do just a species search. You put in a species name, and it goes out to this online resource called GBIF. It's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And GBIF gets all of its data from museums, herbaria, university collections all over the world. Oh, and iNaturalist. So a lot of the research grade iNaturalist sightings goes into GBIF. And so that's great current data. LifeMapper goes out to GBIF, pulls the records from GBIF, and then uses some climate algorithms, including Maxent, to try and figure out where the species is now and then where it will be. Again, it does it, if you just, kind of use the defaults, it does it kind of on this global basis. And so that may or may not really inform the question that you're interested in.
Yeah, and just kind of backing up a little bit, as far as what the current state is right now for seed sourcing, it's been acknowledged that we need to start looking at this for more than a decade. And there's just been a lot of analysis paralysis. So even within land manager, you may only have one person doing all that GIS work and typically not a lot of modeling. So there's definitely this skill set needs to be taught or encouraged or focused somewhere, and maybe Chicago Wilderness would be a good place to do that. I know that they have a new focus on sharing geospatial data and sharing it in a way that's publicly accessible. So maybe that would be a good kind of test case for looking at ways to use that data in a way that's accessible and helpful to a lot of different land managers.
And especially that some of the goals include climate change. There's a climate change goal, but there's also a land management goal. And there's a goal to promote young professionals in the field, and could be that sweet spot that brings everything together.
I have a question in my mind too, in regards to the number of species that are generally in a seed mix for restoration. So typically for any given habitat, we might work with several hundred species. So I'm curious, what are some of the ideas for scaling up this effort? Creating these individual, models is great, but how do we bring that into the practical reality of designing seed mixes?
That's a big question. And honestly, that is the question. And I think, I'm not sure that LifeMapper is like the right tool to do that, but it's a good tool to start with. Because you can upload a whole list of species and then get out, at least some idea of how all of these species might move. The real answer is to do something called an ensemble model. And ensemble modeling has a couple of different pieces. You can do an ensemble model for a single species where you look at every single climate change scenario and see what all of those predictions are, and then essentially layer them on top of each other to look at how the probabilities, the additive probabilities of all of those models tell you what the species is going to do. But you can kind of do a similar approach where you layer the models of, maybe 30 species, I wouldn't say hundreds, but maybe 30 species of the real workhorse species, and maybe kind of the most phylogenetically important species, and do all of those models individually, and then do essentially an ensemble modeling attempt where you take all of those together and see kind of where the probable movement of those species is across space.
So I think it's good to discuss, maybe opening this to everybody, but the paper that we're discussing talks about how depending on different projections of climate and ranges for certain species, you might want to mix populations in different ways to use them in restoration. There are still, I think, land managers that are uncomfortable with the idea of mixing populations, and they're uncomfortable with sourcing seed from other locations that is not, local to the restoration site. So how do you, what's the best way to have this conversation, or to kind of talk through these ideas, knowing that there's definitely some concern among managers that you're going to bring something in that's going to become invasive. I think that's like sort of the main concern associated with moving seeds, and then in terms of mixing populations, some of the questions about swamping or other genetic issues that people are concerned about.
Or if a land manager has a goal of preserving the genetic makeup of the population.
Also, one thing I thought was interesting going back to this paper, and this is again the more hypothetical or theoretical, is that when you follow the decision tree that they have there of like, what is your actual situation and how does your location kind of fit within what the predicted climate shifts are, then that diagram really walks you through which type of provenancing strategy makes sense for that. And there are some where you've got, a much more defined or clearly delineated, a stronger kind of shift, and a species that's currently doing well at your site, the climate may no longer be suitable or for each other. There'll be a mismatch there. And that's kind of, I guess, thinking of it that way, you can see how you're going to be losing some species, and may need to think about which ones will be able to shift in and fill some of those niches that would otherwise be left empty. But I understand, it's going to take some big shifts in our thinking as well, and how we've approached restoration ecology really with this backward facing view of looking at reference ecosystems, which are still really important, and the species that are assembled in each of those. But it's certainly very difficult to deny that we really need to be looking forward and open to those new combinations of species.
My goal when I used to source a lot of seed was to get it within the boundaries we had established, but as genetically diverse as possible. So if one grower had it from 8 different sources, I would ask, at the pain, I would ask to get a little bit from each one of those. That's a lot of working with spreadsheets, because they don't, and rightly so, you don't have the capacity or time to go through. So they can send you a big spreadsheet, and then you have to combine their spreadsheets with your spreadsheets and see where the counties overlap or not, or the origins. And just, establishing relationships, finding out new growers, wild collecting, sometimes collecting in the wild and working with a grower to propagate this. So if you knew they had a project down the line, so you would have the seed that was genetically diverse from different populations. So that's, if you knew there was something large that could happen. But it's a lot of tedious and meticulous work going back and forth. I bet Cassi and Anna and others have good insights for that too. And also telling people why you're doing it. I think I would tell people, it's like, hey, I'm looking to source things from central to southern Illinois, and it's because of climate change. And sometimes, you'd get a chuckle, or sometimes people would be interested. And that was, some time ago. But people sometimes got inspired by that, and because mostly they care about what they do and why they do it, they'd want to help you out.
And actually, I think what might be really fascinating is if you have sourced species from further south, has there been any follow-up? Has there been enough time to have follow-up to see how their establishment has gone, and are they able to actually establish viable populations over time in this region?
And then how do you compare it, right? Like, are you doing half a project this new way, or half a project with very local, and then you're comparing? Because as we found out from research, if it's a dry year, or wet year, hot year, or cold year, that influences how a restoration establishes. Is it one that, you know, had a lot of invasive management done beforehand? Are you enhancing some of your restorations with plugs? And then where is the seed source for those plugs? Are you doing seeding just one time, or overseeding, or doing seeding with grasses to do more invasive management and then overseeding the forbs? There's so many variables.
I will say, when we did survey land managers and nonprofits and restoration volunteers in 2012, we asked that question, whether people were tracking that information, and it was a unanimous no. I mean, it's just like Lisa says, it's really hard to do those types of studies, but actually gain meaningful information from it because of all those variables.
Lots of variables, and I would also say the time frame would have to be quite long, I think, depending on, you know, what you're interested in answering, what questions you're interested in answering. But I think in general, land managers don't necessarily have the time to commit to doing experimental studies of that nature, but there's definitely a need for it.
I think it's also another idea for Chicago Wilderness to explore if there's a practical way to make a streamlined monitoring protocol for projects in the Chicago region, that managers can collect that data when they're out doing stewardship or other type of work, you know, not make it too onerous or a lot of extra tasks, but to at least be able to get some key pieces of data.
I don't have this information like readily available, but I do know there is a consortium of prairie restoration monitors and researchers in like the Great Plains who have, in just the past couple of years, attempted to create a standardized protocol. I'm not sure if it's getting traction or what its name is, so maybe don't.
There's the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. Is that it?
That might be it.
That I think that's got a lot of Pauline Drobny at Neil Smith and a few other restorationists and botanists from Illinois have been the leaders on that.
I think a few things we discussed here could be tools that land managers could definitely benefit from.
Hi, this is Patti from the Climate Resilient Seed Working Group. We're going to have a question and answer session following this presentation. Thanks for joining Growing Through Change, Sourcing Climate Resilient Seed.
Thank you so much, Patti. And I know that you've referenced this a bit, but I love to, since I'm the moderator and have the floor, I would love to ask you your thoughts about sort of how you vision sort of the future of this project, sort of as a project. There were so many variables we've been talking about, but sort of where's the project itself heading?
Well, one of the most basic things that I think we need to do is to just try and figure out kind of the state of the science. And that's one of the things that our working group is doing right now. I talked a little bit about kind of where our literature search has landed to date, where most of the work that's been done has been done on tree species. But we can use kind of that finding to inform how herbaceous species might also, what the pitfalls and opportunities might be for herbaceous species as well. So that's a really big piece of it, is just trying to finish what the state of the science is at the moment. And then I would love to have a group of collaborators work together to come up with, the list of species that everybody is curious about. Pete Jackson mentioned species that are coming in from the south and whether or not we think we should be quote unquote roguing them out or keeping them. So, looking at the climate models for those species, I don't necessarily know what they are. But I'd love to know what people are finding so that we can maybe do some of that modeling. I think Life Mapper is a great beginning, but there are people who have more time and ability to do some of this climate modeling across the region. I think it would be great to work together to try and figure out what some of these sourcing strategies might be. And then finally, I do think we need more demonstration projects to try and regionally kind of hone our sourcing strategies to really try and determine the best practices as we're kind of going through this transition period.
Fantastic. Speaking of Pete, as a quick follow-up, as some questions begin to come in, I'm wondering also how your research can connect to some of the climate modeling. Like we have that project out of the Nature Conservancy that's sort of trying to identify some of the most climate resilient parcels of land to target for protection for land trusts and agencies and things like that. Do you see that there could be some sort of overlaps with these kinds of projects to be able to be as smart as possible in thinking about land preservation?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in the Midwest, we have limited capacity for additional land preservation, but trying to figure out what the best use of our financial resources to do that for future climate resiliency, I think is really important. And some of it has to look at both what how the community might change and how the species within those communities might be more resilient, but also trying to understand things like changing flooding patterns, et cetera, as precipitation changes as well. Looking at how the lakeshore is going to change is also another really important thing. I mean, those are just huge questions, and I think it's going to take a lot of people trying to work together and being collaborative with their findings for us to really understand kind of more broadly what some of those patterns are going to look like.
Fantastic. I'm going to welcome Izabella onto the stage to join you also, and while she is in Becky also, and while they're coming on, we have a question from Kathy Garness referencing that the Chicago Botanic Garden is collecting seeds from Southern Illinois. How will those collections assist or inform your research?
That's a great question, Kathy. Yeah, they do have those collections. And some of those collections, as well as ones that have been purposefully collected for the project at Grant Woods, are going to be put into that restoration project to try and assess some of those questions. So we are trying to take advantage of some of the existing resources to answer some of these questions.
Excellent. We have another question. How do you envision some of this research influencing the Cook County Forest Preserves and others' guidance to stewards for seed sourcing?
So I'm a steward with Cook County Forest Preserves, so I can take that. It really is up to them. As stewards, we agree to obey certain policies, and they do have a seed policy as a few years back, and it differs per site. So you can have conversations and try to convince your local ecologist about this, but I think some of the changes have to happen on a higher level, or maybe not as much changes as how they're willing to interpret the document that was developed with in conjunction with the Illinois Prairie Institute. Because if you look at the plan, it does talk about sourcing within the county or further south if needed. So as much as we understand wanting to keep the same genotype for some remnant areas or nature preserves, like the site I steward is a grade C prairie with a small area that's a grade B prairie. And in my opinion, I think it would benefit from bringing in some more seed. And right now, seed is hard to purchase. So we do seed collecting, but it's really up to them. They're scientists, and as scientists, they follow the scientific method. So we hope the data speaks to them.
Excellent, thank you. Cassie in the chat is referencing the polls. And it might be great to go and have a look at those. So I'd invite those. Everyone can click the polls button at the top of the stage chat, and we can see the results of those polls. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of live reactions to some of the results. Thank you for joining us on stage, Becky.
Sorry, my camera was not working, and I was yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
I would say a lot of people say to that question, when you source from further south, that the results result in an established population of your target species, and many people say, I don't know, or I don't source from further south. And that sounds right, because how do you know that this site is really flourishing and thriving? Because you did awesome invasive management ahead of time, and you're staying on top of things, and maybe you restored hydrology. So is the seed helping, or is the fact that you did all this work ahead of time helping, right? Like we discussed, there's so many different variables. So yeah, that does not surprise me that's one of the polls. It's interesting that some people are sourcing from further than 250 miles. And about a third is up to 50 miles. Sorry, Patty.
Yeah, no, I'm quite interested as well that there are people who have sourced from quite far south. It's a high percentage, but there's not many votes. So if you have done any of this sourcing, we would love to know. It's anonymous, so you won't get in trouble. I have heard a lot of anecdotal sources from a lot of anecdotal sources that people have sourced some things from further south. And so I know that it has happened. And sometimes it's happened because you can't get seeds from anywhere else, or sometimes it's happened because the things at the northern extent of their range may not be doing very well. And so you're bringing stuff in to kind of augment or do some kind of facilitated adaptation. And that's, particularly what I'm interested in learning about. So would love to have some more answers from the polls.
I love the way that Cassie translated that in the stage chat. If your org has a seed policy, how frequently do you ignore it completely?
Yeah.
We have a question, a follow-up question from Kathy. Will Lake County Forest Preserve District be updating its seed sourcing range policy in the near future?
Ooh, good question. And, we already do have a pretty climate forward sourcing policy. We source using a kind of a circumference of 250 miles from the center of Lake County. And our priority or highest preference is for stuff that is in the southern portion of that area. So we already have tried to address that issue. And depending on the outcome of some of the work that's being done at Grant Woods, we may want to revisit how that
that policy. I think it really depends. It may be species specific. It may be that we find that our standard sourcing is working and continues to work and is better than the more southerly provenance, at least for the time being.
Patti, I bet people are interested. What are you measuring to determine whether that seeding is successful?
That's a great question. So we have, it's agricultural fields, about 120 acres. Some portion of the area has been set aside for our standard or conventional sourcing, which is exactly kind of what we're doing on a typical restoration from an ag field. And then the rest of it is trying to source from further south. And we are doing mixed provenancing, some from pretty far south, some from mid-central Illinois. And then we have 60 random plots that we've put out there. So we've done the before treatment and we'll continue to do after. And we will look for things like seed germination, seedling establishment rates. We'll look for things like species cover in the future. Once we've kind of put all of these seeds out on the field, we'll look in the longer term, or we'll especially look for things like differences in phenology from the southern provenance to the standard provenance. You know, does flowering time preclude moving those things further north? Is there enough? Is our current growing season long enough for those things to even fill seed properly, etc.? And so those are some of the things that we hope to look for. We're trying to kind of recruit from local high schools to have them come and help us take a lot of this data. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you volunteer for that effort. Hopefully in the future, we'll also be able to do things like look at differences in pollinator, pollinator visitation. All of that is under the assumption that, we get things really well established. But, the idea that these seeds, it's just so complex, and it's going to be across the life history of those species. And so it's a really long-term project and requires really long-term and pretty consistent monitoring.
We have a question from Pete Jackson. He writes, Patti, curious who does the southern seed collecting for your Grant Woods project?
So it's a combination. We are sourcing from using a bid process from, a whole slew of new vendors in the southern portion of Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky. And then we also have small batch collections done by hand. We have a contract with the Chicago Botanic Garden to undertake those particular collections. And so, it's kind of a mixed strategy trying to get that seed.
Patti, I also have a question for you, which is, how are you keeping apart the more local ecotypes from the more southern ecotypes? And are you controlling for those species breeding with one another?
We are not going to control for those species breeding with each other. In fact, that's one of the benefits of this project, hopefully, is that, it is going to be one continuous habitat. They will be able to interbreed. So in the very, very long term, maybe 20 years, it will be a long-term project looking at sort of facilitated migration, if you will, or facilitated adaptation with a heavier ratio of these southern species. And that, we'll see if it works. It's a little risky for that long term, but that's one of the reasons why this is such a great project site. There's no remnant prairies that can be affected by that. It's it's kind of a standalone, isolated patch of agricultural fields, previously agricultural fields. So it's a good place to try this.
Looks like one more question from Saari. I guess climate change effects are essentially temperature changes. Do we know what extent light levels, which are not going to change much, versus temperature changes affect movement of plants north to south? And there are no dumb questions, Saari.
And actually, it's a really great question. You're right. The light regime will not change, and so that's part of the issue, especially with spring flowering species. They tend to have their flowering time more affected by day length than the later flowering species, and so they might actually, if we were to source them from very far south, they might actually have a real mismatch in terms of their flowering time relative to when insects are emerging. That's one possibility. So it's, and precipitation also is quite important in terms of climate change, differences in precipitation patterns. So it's really, it is really quite complex.